Dundee, a small port city in eastern Scotland. Not famous, nothing remarkable about it. The night of 27 July 2023 was no different, until the security cameras in the Kingsway area began recording. A woman, crouching in on herself, walking slowly, hiding behind a wall as though that wall could save her. A man, shouting, driving straight towards her, grabbing her, dragging her back. She couldn't run. She couldn't call for help. She simply followed him slowly, exhausted like someone who had been worn down long before that night. They walked onto a footbridge, and only one of them came back down. What did the Scottish courts call it? An accident? Suicide? Or something the legal system had never dared to name until 2026? For the first time in Scottish history, a man was convicted of a criminal offense not because he pushed her over the edge, but because he had driven her to a point where she had no way out. And her death was the direct consequence. This is the story of Kimberly Milne. Kimberly Bruce was born in Scotland. She wasn't the kind of person you read about in history books. She wasn't famous. She wasn't someone the world knew by name until it was too late. She was simply an ordinary young woman in an ordinary city. Warm in a way that everyone close to her noticed from the very first meeting. She loved her family quietly, without making a show of it, without needing anyone's recognition. But Kimberly had one thing she never chose: health problems that made her more dependent than most people, more vulnerable than most, in need of care in a way that not everyone had the patience to give. And that was the very first thing the man she would later meet noticed. Not her smile, not her heart, but the empty space where he could step in and become the only thing she needed. In the early days, the relationship seemed ordinary, perhaps even better than ordinary. But gradually, very slowly, very skillfully, Kimberly's world began to shrink. Fewer friends, more distance from her family. Her phone was no longer truly her own. And in a message presented in court, a message she sent to a family member while trying to explain why she couldn't leave, Kimberly wrote, "How can I leave when he says he'll hurt himself if I'm not with him?" That wasn't the question of someone who was weak. It was the question of someone being held captive by her own love, turned into chains by the person who should have protected her. Kimberly Milne wasn't weak. She was trapped in a carefully constructed snare, built one brick at a time, over the course of 18 months. Lee Milne, 39 years old, Dundee, Scotland. Looking at him, you wouldn't see anything remarkable. Not someone who looked frightening. Not someone you'd look at and immediately feel that something was wrong. That was exactly the problem. People like Lee Milne don't begin with violence. They begin with concern. With small questions: where are you? Are you home yet? Why did it take you so long? It looks like worry. It looks like love. Until you realize it isn't worry. It's surveillance. Hour after hour. Day after day. Until Kimberly no longer dared to pick up her phone without thinking of him first. The court heard evidence of a strategy carried out systematically and coldly. He checked her phone. He restricted where she could go. He gradually severed every connection Kimberly had with the outside world, her friends, her family, her personal space, until he was all she had left. And when Kimberly tried to leave, he didn't need to use his fists. He only needed one sentence: "I'll hurt myself if you leave me." Kimberly's love, the most beautiful part of her, became a weapon used against her. But behind that psychological control was physical violence that was no less calculated. Strangling her, dragging her by the hair, punching her until she fell, until she lost consciousness, then apologizing, then saying, "I'm not that kind of person." And Kimberly, a woman trapped without food, without money, with no way out, had to choose between believing his words or facing a truth she was not yet strong enough to confront. And this is what the court revealed after the trial had ended. While awaiting trial over Kimberly's death, Lee Milne was convicted of sexually assaulting 2 children. This was not a man who lost control in a moment of weakness. This was a man who knew exactly what he was doing and who had done it to more than one victim. January 2022. Nothing happens overnight. Domestic abuse doesn't work that way. It doesn't begin with a punch. it begins with a sentence, a small rule, a boundary pushed back just a little, then a little further, until Kimberly could no longer remember where the original boundary had been because it had disappeared long ago. In the first month, he only wanted to know where she was. By the third month, he had started checking her phone. By the sixth month, Kimberly's friends were no longer hearing from her. By the ninth month, he locked her inside the flat. No food, no money, no keys. Kimberly sat in that room with no way to call anyone without him knowing. Lady Drummond read each line of the sentence in a steady, cold voice. You repeatedly seized her by the throat, restricting her breathing. You repeatedly punched her to the head and body. You dragged her by the hair. Those words read aloud in a silent courtroom described what Kimberly had endured alone in a flat where no one could see her suffering. There were times when she tried to leave. Not once. Many times. Each time, he pulled her back. With threats. With violence. Or with tears and promises she knew were false, yet still clung to because they were all she had left. There is a question people often ask women like Kimberly. Why didn't she leave? The real answer is never as simple as the question. She had no money to leave. She had nowhere to go. She no longer had anyone close enough to call at 2 o'clock in the morning. And he had told her over and over again, until she believed him that if she left, he would not let her go alone. 27 July 2023. Kimberly and Lee Milne had ended their relationship. But the end of a relationship doesn't mean freedom, not with someone like him. He knew Kimberly was at her most vulnerable point in those 18 months, and he chose that very day to go to her. For the last time. Evening of 27 July 2023. Dundee was still alive. The streetlights were still on. People were still heading home after a long day. No one knew that night that the security cameras in the Kingsway area were recording something that would change the history of Scottish justice forever. Kimberly did not go to him. He went to her. They had broken up. But Lee Milne did not understand separation in the usual sense. For him, breaking up only meant she had not managed to get far enough away for him to no longer reach her. He knew Kimberly was at her most fragile state in the entire 18 months. He knew because he had created that state day by day, and that night he chose to appear. In the Kingsway car park, the pale yellow light of the city fell on two people standing not far apart. But that distance was not enough to protect her. Kimberly shrank in on herself, shoulders down, head down, in the way that people only learn after hundreds of times of being made to feel that their presence is a burden to others. Milne shouted at her. She walked away. Not running, because running requires believing there is somewhere to go. She simply walked. Step by step. Like someone who had been exhausted long before that night. He got into his car and drove straight towards her. Not an accident, not a wrong turn. Straight towards her, as though the car was an extension of what he had been doing with his hands for the past 18 months. She hid behind a wall, back against the wall, breathing, waiting. He pulled her out. Then she followed him. Not because she wanted to, but because after everything that had happened, her body had learned a lesson no one should ever have to learn. Resisting only made things worse. She walked behind him, slowly, silently, a few steps away, as though that distance could give her something she no longer had a name for. They walked towards the A90 Kingsway West flyover. On that bridge, Kimberly looked down at the road below. Cars were still moving. Headlights sweeping back and forth in the night. The city was still breathing, completely unaware of what was happening, a few dozen meters above the ground. She stood there. Then she climbed over the barrier. And jumped. Lady Drummond, 3 years later, would read these lines in a cold courtroom in Glasgow. Kimberly Milne reached a point of despair to the extent that she climbed over the bridge barrier and fell to her death. That was a direct consequence of your actions. Lee Milne left the bridge. Kimberly was struck by multiple vehicles on the A90 below. She died at the scene. She was 28 years old. The security cameras in the Kingsway area continued recording. The city of Dundee continued moving. But in those recordings, in every second she shrank in on herself. Every step she tried to escape. Every moment she was pulled back. There is evidence that the Scottish courts would use to rewrite the way the legal system understands domestic abuse forever. 3 years. 3 years since that night on the bridge in Dundee before the Scottish courts were ready to name what had happened. February 2026. High Court of Justiciary, Glasgow. Not an ordinary trial. Because the question being asked had never been asked before in the history of Scottish justice. Can a man be convicted of murder when he did not directly carry out the act? Prosecutor Alex Prentice, one of the most experienced in Scotland, stood before the jury and did not need to prove that Lee Milne had pushed Kimberly. He only needed to prove one thing, that without him, Kimberly would still be alive. The prosecution's argument did not rely on rhetoric. It relied only on facts arranged in chronological order, cold and undeniable. 18 months of systematic abuse, controlling messages, and CCTV footage from the night of 27 July, recording every final step Kimberly took before she climbed over the barrier. The defense argued back. Kimberly's death, they said, was the result of pre-existing mental health issues that existed before she met Milne, that it was her own decision, that no one can be held responsible for something they did not directly do. The jury listened. Then they reviewed the footage. Then they read the messages again. And they delivered their verdict. 2 March 2026. Unanimous. Guilty culpable homicide. Manslaughter. Guilty, domestic abuse, systematic throughout the entire relationship. Lee Milne denied everything to the end. It changed nothing. 10 April 2026. Lady Drummond rose to her feet. By the verdict of the jury, you are held responsible not only for the entirety of the abusive conduct but also for her death. 8 years imprisonment. 3 years of mandatory supervision after release. This was the first time in Scottish history after a full trial that a person was convicted of a criminal offence for domestic abuse that drove their partner to death. No weapon required. No presence at the scene required. Only 18 months of systematically destroying a person until they could no longer see any reason to stay. And from 1 April 2026, every suspected suicide in Scotland with signs of domestic abuse will be subject to mandatory investigation. A new law, created from a death. Kimberly Milne would never know it, but perhaps it was what she deserved to receive. 8 years. That is the sentence the Scottish courts considered to be proportionate to 18 months of hell and a life taken at the age of 28. Some say it is justice, some say it is not enough. The answer depends on where you stand in this story. But there is one number that no one disputes. Every week, 3 women in England and Scotland take their own lives because of domestic abuse. Not every month, every week. Kimberly Milne was one of them. But she was the first whose death the Scottish courts were willing to look at directly and say her death was not her choice. It was the consequence of a crime. This case did not end when Lee Milne entered prison. It began when everyone who watched the news that day looked at their own relationship, or that of someone close to them, and, for the first time, dared to ask the question. Kimberly Milne did not jump because she wanted to die. She jumped because he took away every reason she had to stay day by day until there was nothing left. That was not suicide. It was the final consequence of an 18-month-long crime. Kimberly Milne, 28 years old. She never saw the summer of 2024.